Acknowledgements Introduction, An Invitation to Bombay 1. A Persuasive Young Bania 2. Lessons from the Souk 3. Catching Live Serpents 4. A First-Class Fountain 5. Guru of the Equity Cult 6. Friends in the Right Places 7. The Great Polyester War 8. The Paper Tiger 9. Under Siege 10. Sleuths 11. Letting Loose a Scorpion 12. Business as Usual 13. Murder Medley 14. A Political Deluge 15. Under the Reforms 16. Housekeeping Secret 17. Pandava or Kaurava. INTRODUCTI. An invitation to Bombay. The envelope was hand-delivered to our house in Golf Links, Tan Enclave in New Delhi, whose name captured the clubbable lifestyle of its leisured and propertied Indian residents, soon after we had arrived in the middle of a North Indian winter to begin a long assignment. It contained a large card, with a picture embossed in red and gold of the elephant-headed deity Ganesh, improbably carried on the back of a much smaller mouse. Durabhai and Kakalaban Ambani invited us to the wedding of their son Anil to Tina Munim in Bombay. In January 1991, just prior to the explosion in car ownership that in later winters kept the midday warmth trapped in a throat-tearing haze overnight, it was bitterly cold most of the time in Delhi. Our furniture had still not arrived. A day of negotiations about the duty payable lay ahead at the Delhi Customs Office, where the container was broken open and inspected, and we camped on office chairs and fold-up beds, wrapped in blankets. The Indian story was also in a state of suspension, waiting for something to happen. The Gulf War, which we watched at a big hotel on this new thing called satellite television, was undercutting many of the assumptions on which the Congress Party's family dynasty, the Nehrus and Gandhis, had built up the Indian state. The Americans were unleashing a new generation of weapons on a third world regime to which New Delhi had been close. Its Soviet friends were standing by, even agreeing with the Americans. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait had pushed up oil prices and forced the Indian government to evacuate some 3 million of its citizens working in the Gulf. The extra $500 million all this cost India was pushing the country close to default on its foreign debt. Officials from the Ministry of Finance were already negotiating a bailout from the IMF in Washington. The IMF was setting stiff conditionalites in effect, a complete shift from Nehru's model of high external protection for the economy and government allocation of savings. Even the CNN clips of Tomahawk cruise missiles zipping neatly down the streets of Baghdad were in themselves part of another breach in India's walls. The cities who ran the national TV monopoly or the big newspapers no longer had India's half-illiterate population to themselves. Little of this was admitted in New Delhi. The coalition government of VP Singh, which had swept out the glamorous Rajiv Gandhi on a battery of corruption scandals, had itself collapsed in November after less than a year in office. India was ruled by an even smaller coalition of opportunists under a wily politico called Chandrasekhar, kept in office at Rajiv's pleasure for who knew how long. Everyone clung to the autarkic, third world verities. Politicians and journalists pounced on the slightest admission by their fellows that perhaps India's vision of the world had been flawed, and it had better adjust to the new order. At the Ministry of External Affairs, in the red sandstone majesty of Sir Herbert Baker's Secretariat buildings, a bright young official on a new economic desk assured me that India's finances were strong enough to take the strains. At a party of intellectuals, young academics and filmmakers in rough cotton kurta pajama suits scoffed at the prospects for satellite TV. How would the advertising payments get out to the broadcaster through the maze of exchange controls, which foreign companies would want to plug products they could neither export to India nor make locally? The wedding invitation was a good excuse to break away from the stalemate in New Delhi and make contact with the Indian commercial class in Bombay. There it looked as if a raw entrepreneurial spirit was straining to break through the discouraging political crust. Word of the Ambani family and their company Reliance Industries had spread to Hong Kong as prime examples of this brash new India which might finally have its day, courtesy of the changes the Gulf War symbolized. Everything about the Ambanis, in fact, was a good magazine story. The young couple's courtship had been a stormy one, ready-made for the Bombay showbiz magazines. The bride, Tina Munim, was a girl with a past. She had been a film starlet, featuring in several of the Hindi-language films churned out by the hundreds every year in Bollywood, most including improbable violence, song and dance routines, and long sequences with the female leads in wet, clingy clothes. Before meeting Anil, Tina had had a heavy, well-publicized affair with a much older actor. The groom, Anil, was the tear-away one of the two Ambani boys. His parents had frowned on the match. Bombay's magnates usually tried to arrange matches that cemented alliances with other powerful business or political families. This one was not arranged, nor did it bring any more than certain popularity. Hired assailants had been sent with acid and knives to scar Tina's face, so went the gossip, apocryphal. Tina's face turned out to be flawless. Anil had threatened suicide if he could not marry Tina, went another rumor. Finally, the parents had agreed. The father, Durabhai, was no less colorful and even more controversial. He had first worked in Aden in the 1950s. I recalled a stopover there in my childhood, aboard the SS Oronsay, a buff-hulled Orient Line ship, en route to my father's posting in London with his Australian bank in 1958. The image was of grim, dark brown peaks surrounding a harbor of brilliant blue, a host of merchant ships tied up to moorings, and a busy traffic of launches and barges. The trip ashore was by launch, landing at Steamer Point, where Arabs and Indians besieged the white faces, trying to sell us Ottoman-style cushions or to drag us into their duty-free shops. Now someone like those desperate salesmen in Aden was a tycoon in Bombay. Ambani had got into polyester manufacturing in a big way, and got huge numbers of Indians to invest in shares of his company, Reliance Industries. In India, the home of fine cotton textiles, it seemed that people couldn't get enough polyester. The only constraint on local producers like Reliance was the government's licensing of their capacity, or where they built their factories. To jack up his capacity, Ambani had become a big political fixer. In the recent minority government formation, it was said, his executives had been shuttling briefcases of cash to politicos all over Delhi. There had been epic battles, with the press Baron Ramnath Gonka of the Indian Express, and with a textile rival from an old Parsi business house, Nusli Wadia. A year or so earlier, a Reliance public relations manager had been arrested for plotting to murder Wadia. The man had been released, and nothing was moving in the case. Was it genuine or a frame-up? Indian colleagues were not sure. No conspiracy was accepted at face value. So we took our first trip inside India, making our way down to New Delhi railway station in a yellow and black cab, one of the 1954 Morris Oxford designs still being. Made in Calcutta, in the rose-colored haze of a winter afternoon, letting a red-shirted porter heave our bags on his head and lead us to the train, establishing our rights to the coveted two-berth compartment in the middle of the first-class, air-conditioned carriage from the list pasted by the door. The train slid across the fat beige northern landscape of wheat stubble and square houses as night fell. In the morning, we were trundling past palm trees and mangrove-bordered creeks before humming into Bombay through suburban stations packed with commuters. If New Delhi was a city of books, discourse, seminars, and not much action or precision, Bombay was one where people made the most of the 9-to-5 working day before battling their way home to the distant suburbs. Most crucially, Bombay had accepted the telephone as a medium of dialogue, not merely as a preliminary to an exchange of letters setting up a meeting. It was also unashamedly concerned with money and numbers. New contacts like Pradip Shah, founder of India's first rating agency for corporate debt, with the slightly alarming acronym of CRISL, or Sucheta Dalal, a business journalist at the Times of India, or Manor Murarka, partner of the old stock-broking firm of Batlivala and Karani, rattled off the details of industrial processes, forward trading in the share market, or conversion dates of debentures at bewildering speed. The wedding was going to be big, so big that it was to take place in a football stadium, the same one where Dhirubhai Ambani had held many of his shareholders' meetings, but it began in an oddly casual way. As instructed, we went mid-afternoon to the Woodhouse Gymkhana Club, some distance from the stadium. There we found guests milling in the street outside, the men dressed mostly in lavishly cut dark suits and showy ties, mustaches trimmed and hair brilliantined. The women were heavily made up, laden with heavy gold jewelry, and wearing lustrous gold-embroidered silk saris. Anil Ambani appeared suddenly from the club grounds, dressed in a white satiny outfit and sequined turban, sitting on a white horse. A brass band in white frogged tunics struck up a brash, repetitive march, and we set off in separate phalanxes of men and women around the groom towards the stadium. Every now and then, the process would pause while the Indian guests broke into a provocative whirling dance, some holding wads of money above their head. The stadium was transformed by tents, banks of marigolds and lights into a make-believe palace, and filled up with 2,000 of the family's closest friends and business contacts. They networked furiously, while a bare-chested Hindu pundit put Anil and Tina through hours of Vedic marriage rites next to a smoldering sandalwood fire on a small stage. Later, the guests descended on an elaborate buffet on tables taking up an entire sideline of the football pitch, starting with all kinds of samosas and other snacks, working through a selection of curries and breads, and finishing with fruits and sweets wrapped in gold leaf. The next day, the Ambanis put on the same spread, if not the wedding ceremony at another reception for 22,000 of their not-so-close friends, employees, and second-echelon contacts. Retrospectively, by the standards of Bombay a few years later, it looks a modest and traditional affair. Before their joint marriage of 3 children in 1996, the ingratiating Hinduja family had an elaborately illustrated book prepared on the Hindu marriage and sent to all invitees. Other business alliances were celebrated with elaborate stage sets based on the ancient epics. Lines of elephants led the processions of the grooms, and diamonds were pasted to the foreheads of women guests. But at the time, the sheer size of the wedding was seen as a sign that Dhirubhai Ambani had made it through the political travails of 1989-90 and was unabashed, and certainly not strapped for cash or friends. It was fattening to be there, and to have a Reliance public relations manager take me up to meet the Ambanis flattening, within a month of arriving in India, to meet the country's fastest moving, most controversial tycoon. An interview was promised shortly, once the festivities were over. An early cover story was clearly a possibility, an antidote to the gloomy political news out of Delhi. It would help my standing at the Far Eastern Economic Review if India was an upbeat business story, and I was right onto it. That, of course, was the desired effect. Reliance was desperate to raise funds for expansion and was looking to foreign sources, so some image building in a prestigious magazine was highly useful. A newcomer to India would be more inclined to play down the controversies and look at the company's prospects. The interview, when it took place a month or so later, was stimulating. Dhirubhai Ambani came limping around a huge desk when I was ushered to a sofa and greeted me warmly. Despite the obvious effects of a stroke in a twisted right hand, his mahogany skin was smooth and healthy, his hair plentiful and slicked back decisively in a duck's tail. His attention was unwavering. Disarmingly, Dhirubhai admitted to many of the youthful episodes that were the subject of rumor, and responded evenly when I raised some of the criticisms commonly leveled against him. He didn't mind people calling him an upstarts or even worse names. It just meant they were trapped in their complacency while he was racing ahead. But the disputes were now histories, and the former critics were now all his good friends buying their polyester and raw materials from him. "Orbit goes on changing," he declared airily. "Nobody is a permanent friend, nobody is a permanent enemy. Everybody has his own self-interest. Once you recognize that, everybody would be better off." However, Ambani did point to an unfortunate trait in his countrymen. "You must know that in this country, people are very jealous." It was not like in Hong Kong or other East Asian countries, where people applauded each other's success, he claimed. In India, success was seen as the prerogative of certain families, but he didn't really mind. "Jealousy is a mark of respect," he said. The interview resulted in a cover story for the Far Eastern Economic Review, which portrayed Ambani as the business underdog trying to break through the government's red tape and the prejudices of a tired Bombay business establishment. Naturally enough, Ambani and his PR men were pleased. His one quibble, I was told, had been my pointing out some glossed-over problem areas in the Reliance annual reports, which had been put in the notes to the accounts, fine print areas that only the professional analysts read. The comments were true enough, but they made it look as though Reliance was unusual among Indian companies in these practices. The Reliance Public Relations Office continued to be attentive, supplying advance notice of newsworthy events. At one point later in 1991, there was another glimpse of Dhirubhai Ambani's energetic mind. His Delhi office passed on a request for information about Indonesia's engagement in the late 1980s of the Swiss cargo clearance from Societe Generale de Surveillance, SGS, to administer its imports and exports, thereby sidelining the country's notoriously corrupt customs service for several years. I sent off some clippings, intrigued that the man accused of smuggling whole factories through the ports of India now seemed to be advocating Swiss efficiency in place of the lax administration of which he had supposedly taken advantage. The proposal got to a high level in the government before being canned, but not before causing panic in the Indian Customs Service, which may have been all Dhirubhai wanted to do anyway. There were daily updates from the Reliance PR staff on an issue of convertible securities issued in the euro market in May 1992. The first by an Indian company and tangible proof of India's reforms reconnecting it to the world economy. There was a company-organized trip out of Bombay up to its new petrochemicals plant at Hazira, involving a bumpy fight in a chartered turboprop to the airfield at Surat, bare of airport terminals or navigational aids as far as could be seen, and a drive through the old textile trading city, squalid despite its lucrative silk and diamond industries, and a couple of years later, notorious for an outbreak of bubonic plague. Across the Tapti River, a glittering array of pipes and towers had indeed come up, and cryogenic tankers full of sub-zero ethylene were tied up at the jetty. Reliance was clearly not just a paper empire, but the history of political and corporate activity had put a sinister shadow across the gleaming success. Through the government changes of 1990 and 1991, the press carried references to a certain large industrial houses supporting this or that party or being behind certain politicians. Scores of party leaders, ex-ministers, senior bureaucrats, and heads of the big government-owned banks and corporations were said to be Ambani friends or Ambani critics. Mostly it was the friends, it seemed, who got the jobs. People made bitter and cynical remarks about the Ambanis in private. The press coverage, especially in the Indian business magazines, had a repetitive quality. A myth was being created and sustained. At a meeting of shareholders in a big Bombay engineering firm named Larsen & Tourbo late in 1991, convened to approve a takeover by the Ambanis, this undercurrent of hostility welled up into a physical melee. In the shouting and jostling, the two Ambani sons had to fee the stage. The controversies kept continuing right through the 1990s. Dhirubhai Ambani attracted adulation or distrust. To his millions of investors, who had seen their share prices multiply, he was a business messiah. To one writer, he was a Frankenstein monsters created by India's experiments with close government control of the economy. There are 3 Dhirubhai Ambanis, one of his fellow Gujaratis, a writer, told me. One is unique, larger than life, a brand name. He is one of the most talked about industrialists, and for Gujarati people he has tremendous emotional and sentimental appeal. He is their ultimate man, and has inspired many emulators. The second Dhirubhai Ambani is a schemer, a first-class liar, who regrets nothing and has no values in life. Then there is the third Dhirubhai Ambani, who has a more sophisticated political brain. A dreamer and a visionary, almost Napoleonic. People are always getting the 3 personalities mistaken. In a legal chamber lined with vellum-bound case references, a senior lawyer took an equally stark view. Today the fact is that Ambani is bigger than government, said the lawyer in all seriousness. He can make or break prime ministers. In the United States you can build up a super corporation, but the political system is still bigger than you. In India the system is weak. If the stock exchange dares to expose Ambani, he tells it, I will pull my company shares out and make you collapse. I am bigger than your exchange. If the newspapers criticize, he can point out they are dependent on his advertising, and he has his journalists in every one of their departments. If the political parties take a stand against him, he has his men in every party who can pull down or embarrass the leaders. He is a threat to the system. Today he is undefeatable. Surprisingly, the role played by Dhirubhai Ambani received only cautious side references in most books about contemporary Indian politics. No biography of him was in the bookshops. although Indian journalists and commentators had produced one quickies biographies of other new celebrities in vast numbers. The work of the economic historians largely cut out in the 1960s. The few biographies of other Indian businessmen were commissioned works, not very well written, and notable for a worshipful attitude to the subjects. No one drank, cursed, cheated, or philandered. Their workers were all part of the family. Almost everyone lived an abstemious vegetarian life, accumulating wealth only to give it away to temples, hospitals, and schools. By 1992, Reliance was tapping investors in Europe for funding, and international investment funds were being allowed to play the Indian share market directly. A few years later, the company had started borrowing in New York on a large scale. The Ambani story was becoming of greater interest outside India, at least to investors, and perhaps to a wider audience watching the explosive growth of capitalism across Asia. The idea of this book occurred in 1992, and I put it to Dhirubhai Ambani later that year at a second meeting in his Bombay office. Ambani seemed receptive, and agreed that his life story could be inspiring for a younger generation of Indians, as well as interesting to those thinking of dealing with India. I left the meeting with an understanding that he had agreed to talk about his life at meetings to be arranged, and that, if so, I would show him the completed draft as a courtesy, and listen to any objections but retain the final say on the content. The book would not be credible otherwise. Ambani concurred. A year slipped away without further progress, and then relations with Reliance took a downturn. By the end of 1993, Reliance was in the bidding for several oil fields in the Arabian Sea. The Government Oil Search Corporation had discovered the fields, but did not have the funds to build the huge production rigs, gas compressors, and pipelines that were needed. Several contacts among rival bidders were alleging that the tender was being rigged in favor of Reliance. Indian politicians and bureaucrats are masters at tilting and pen and transparent tender into a one-horse race, by techniques such as keeping the weighting of bidding factors uncertain or secretly promising later concessions to compensate for underbidding. In the event, Reliance swept the field, and a director with one of the losers told me, "We were shafted, and for the wrong reasons." Writing about this would not advance my request for access to the Ambanis for the book, but my duty was to the magazine that employed me. The first of 2 articles in the Far Eastern Economic Review about the Oldfields battle drew a bitter complaint from Anil Ambani that the report was defamatory, a complaint not sent directly to me, or to the magazine, but in a letter sent to the head of one of the rival companies, the Australian resources giant BHP, and copied to the heads of the American and Australian diplomatic missions in New Delhi. Thereafter, I wrote occasionally about Reliance, and in July 1995, left my job with the magazine to spend more time on the book. A letter to Dhirubhai Ambani informing him of this move went unanswered. Over the following 18 months, the research led me into all corners of Bombay life, from the slum homes of the semi-criminal underworld to the offices of powerful business tycoons, to several cities and towns in Gujarat on crowded country buses and trains, to converted churches in London and Leicester, ringing with the Hindu chants of the Gujarati diaspora. The reception varied. Almost everyone wanted to know if the book was authorized or sponsored. It was neither, I said, but Ambani had been told and so far had not expressed to me a view either way about it. Many of those people who knew Dhirubhai Ambani in his early days in Junagadh and Aden, and then starting his business in Bombay, were willing to talk. Some others, such as his former Aden colleague and Middle East coordinator in Dubai, Burrit Kumar Shah, asked for a letter of clearance from Ambani himself, which again was not forthcoming. One Bombay journalist who agreed to share his knowledge picked up the telephone immediately I arrived at his flat and rang Anil, Ambani's office. "I have told him if you are wanting scandal you will lose the whole story," he said down the phone to the executive who answered. The next day, I was invited to lunch by a pair of Reliance public relations executives and quizzed closely about my intentions. Dhirubhai Ambani did respond to a birthday greeting sent at the end of December 1995, but there was still no word about his attitude to the book. A month later, however, I flew especially to Bombay for an interview arranged with his former export managers Rathibhai Machala, who, according to numerous other sources, knew everything about the early days. At the appointed time, Muchhala was not at his office in the industrial belt behind Bombay's airport. A secretary telephoned him. He was at the Reliance head office. Muchhala was sorry, but Ambani's office had advised him not to meet me. Ambani's personal assistant, Dinesh Sheth, then confirmed this. There were several proposals for biographies, and some months earlier Dhirubhai Ambani had indicated to his staff that he did not want at that stage to encourage or cooperate with any of them. Sheth professed ignorance of my previous letters, so I sent another the next day, offering to come at any time to discuss the book. Ironically, the reception among those figures who had been critics or opponents of Reliance was also wary. Firoz Vakil, a senior advocate in tiny chambers in Bombay's old fort, surveyed me intently while stuffing Aaronmore flake tobacco into his pipe, and warned that people would suspect I was being used by the Ambanis to draw out information. Among some others, my earlier favorable write-ups of the Ambanis still told against me. "I suppose you think he's a hero," said the retired finance ministry official and cabinet secretary Vinod Pand, down the phone. Others just seemed too battle-weary. When I rang the Orkay Silk Mills chairman Kapil Mehra and asked to meet him, there was a long pause. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Mehra said. The former Prime Minister Viswanath Pratap Singh did not reply to a letter and giggled nervously when I cornered him at a cocktail party in New Delhi. No, he could not possibly talk about any one company, Singh said, easing away quickly. Those who did agree to talk for the most part insisted on anonymity. They had to live in India, they explained. Word of some of these meetings must have been passed back to Reliance, for in January 1997, a stiff letter arrived from Kanga & Co. in Bombay, lawyers for Dhirubhai Ambani and the company, warning that their clients understand and apprehend that the proposed publication contains material which is defamatory to our client. It was claimed that in no time had there been any attempt to verify the material with the clients. Action for exemplary damages and injunction against publication were threatened if the book was defamatory. At this point, it had not even been completed, let alone delivered to the publishers. Fortunately, the several controversies that hit Reliance in the second half of 1995 produced a deluge of paper from Indian government agencies. The various reports opened up many previously obscure and controversial aspects of the company's operations. At the same time, the controversies compelled Reliance to give its own explanations, which became part of the public record. Even so, the overall result, unavoidably, has been a book that becomes progressively less intimate to its subject as the story advances, drawing more on published reports, available documentation, and anonymous interviews with those who had engaged with Dhirubhai Ambani and Reliance Industries from the outside. The book is less satisfactory and less sympathetic, perhaps, than it might have been with cooperation from the Ambanis and access to them. As my research and writing progressed, however, word came from several sources that the family was compiling its own record of Dhirubhai Ambani's life and his company's growth, so a version of events from the inside may also be put to the public soon. A persuasive young Bania among all the 550-odd princely rulers left, with British residents at their shoulders, to run their domains in the last years of the Raj. Few were more eccentric than Mahabat Khan, the Nawab of Junagadh. The Nawab's family had run this fiefdom, one of several in a political jigsaw covering the Saurashtra peninsula in Gujarat, since a Faujdar or military commander of the Mughal Empire named Sher Khan Babi founded his own subordinate dynasty in 1690. 2.5 centuries later, this warrior's descendant was best known for his love of dogs. Mahabat Khan had 150 of them, with an equal number of dog handlers on his payroll and individual quarters for all the canine retinue. To celebrate the one wedding off one canine pair, the Nawab was reputed to have spent 2 million rupees, then worth about 150 sterling, and to have given his 700 subjects a public holiday. The Nawab was the first political target to come into the sights of Dhirubhai Ambani, although it is unlikely that he was ever specifically aware of it. It was during a movement aimed at overthrowing the Nawab's rule and securing Junagadh's accession to India during the partition of British India in 1947 that Ambani, then a teenage high school student, had his first experience of political organization and his first brushes with authority. It was the only moment in modern times that Junagadh has figured in the calculations of nations and statesmen. Even in the 1990s, Junagadh and its surrounds, known as the Kathiawar region, remains one of the quietest, most traditional regions of India, and one of the least accessible in the otherwise busy northwest coastal area of the country. A few times a week, a turboprop flies into the simple airstrip at Keshad, unloading people from Bombay or the Gujarati diaspora overseas coming to visit their relatives and make offerings to family gods at local temples. In the town itself, clusters of 1940s Ford Mercury taxis wait for groups of passengers or for hire at weddings. The railway network was built to connect each of the several former principalities of Kathiawar to the outside world rather than with each other. Once you are in Kathiawar, all now part of Gujarat state, traveling between towns often means one or more changes of line and extensive doglegs and backtracking in the journey. The last steam engine on regular service in India, apart from scenic mountain railways, puffed between Junagadh and the Gir Sanctuary for the last Asiatic lions. Until 1996, the land itself is dry, open, and stony. The monsoon rains quickly run off down the short rivers and nuillas that radiate from the central rocky hinterland out to the sea. The roads are lined with stunted pipal, fig trees, and the stony fields are fenced with straggling rows of cactus. The standard building material is a porous dung-colored stone cut by saws into ready-made blocks from pits near the seashore. There are few of the modern ferro-cement extravagances built by the newly rich, hardly any of the industrial plants, and their residential colonies seen extending out into farmland in other Indian regions, and only a few private cars. But if the landscape is monotonous, Kathiawar's people compensate for it with riotous color where they can. The women drape themselves with cotton scarves tie-dyed in red and orange. The local scooter taxi is the Enfield motorcycle grafted to a fat tray resting on two wheels at the back, with the handlebars decked with colored lights, electric horns, and whirling windmills. The homes of wealthy merchants are decorated with moldings of swans, peacocks, flamingos, parrots, elephants, lions, and tigers. Massive double doors, 12-paneled with heavy iron studs, open tantalizingly onto huge inner courtyards. A blood-drenched history and complicated mythology are attached to the landmarks and constructions of Kathiawar. On the coast to its west, at Dwarka, is the place where Lord Krishna died. To the south, the Temple of the Moon at Somnath is a center for Hindu pilgrims from all over India. In the steep Girnar hills above the city of Junagadh, long staircases take pilgrims to Jain temples dating back to the 3rd century, BC. Looming over Junagadh city, the fortified rock citadel of Uparkot has inscriptions and cave sculptures from the time of the 3rd century BC ruler Ashoka. The city was an important center for Hindu rulers of Gujarat in the 1st millennium. Then, starting with the Afghan warlord Mahmud of Ghazni, who invaded in 1024 AD and pillaged Somnath, Junagadh suffered 4 centuries of sackings. Mughal rule gave it some stability with Muslim rulers controlling its largely Hindu population. Both its rulers and its people were passive onlookers in the contest for India's trade among the English, Dutch, and Portuguese, whose galleons fought vicious battles off the Gujarat coast. A 5-meter-long cannon broods over the town from the ramparts, a relic of an unsuccessful attack on the Portuguese trading post at Diu, on the coast southeast of Junagadh, by the feet of Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent of Turkey in the 15th century. At night, seen from the coastline at the south of Junagadh, processions of navigation lights travel left and right along the horizon. The seaborne traffic between the west coast of India and the Arabian ports goes on, as it has for millennia, ever more intense. Gujarat was the trading hub of ancient India, where Indian cottons and silks were traded to Arabs, and later the first English East India Company in return for silver, gold, incense, and coffee from the Red Sea port of Mecca. Up until the early 15th century, Chinese junks had also come to western India. Later, India and India-based European traders became the trade intermediaries between the Arab and Chinese spheres. The Gujaratis were prominent in this pre-colonial Indian Ocean trading network, with the wealth of India in its cloths, indigo, opium, and spices merchandise. The small ports of Kathiawar took part in this trade. Diu handled much of Gujarat's trade with Aden in the west and Malacca in the Cast. Gold, silver, quicksilver, vermilion, copper, and woolen cloth would be exchanged for Indian gold and silver embroideries and brocades, and for cotton muslins of a fineness expressed by trade terms such as a browen, running water, baft hava, woven air, or shabnam evening dew. Later, of course, the East India Company grabbed its monopolies in opium, tea, indigo, and spices in a three-way trade equation between China, India, and Europe. Topped up later by the British Empire with gold bullion from Britain's new colonies in South Africa and Australia at the southern corners of the Indian Ocean. Indian entrepreneurs. In Calcutta, the Marwari traders and moneylenders originally from Rajasthan. In Bombay, the Parsis, Zoroastrians originally from Persia, began moving into large-scale industrial production late in the 19th century. Smaller traders also took advantage of Pax Britannica by taking steamer passages to all corners of the Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asian passports were needed and opening small stores and service stations. Most were from Gujarat, a large proportion of these from Kathiawar. Two of the biggest commercial families in Uganda, the Mehtas and the Madwals, came from Porbandar, and the thriving Shandarlas of Kenya came from Jamnagar. Until 1938, the free port of Aden was part of the Bombay administration. The East African shilling, the currency of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade, was virtually pegged to the Indian rupee in value. The Gujaratis were stingy with their customers and stingy with themselves. Bhaskar Bhattacharya, a television broadcaster in New Delhi, spent his childhood years in Uganda where his father was a British colonial official. The Epicurean ways of the Bhattacharyas from Bengal contrasted sharply with those of the Patels or Shahs from Gujarat. When we first arrived, the women took my mother aside and said, "This is the way you do things," he remembers. If you were invited for dinner, you got a couple of vegetable dishes and rice. My parents liked to splash out and serve meat and fish to their guests. Of course, by the time we left, the Gujarati peon in my father's office had probably saved more than he had. The wealth was the result of rigorous saving, abstemious living, and endless hours of work by unpaid family members' migrant success story in many parts of the world. In East Africa, it created a resentment that led to the expulsion of the Indian traders and appropriation of their assets after the colonies became independent in the 1960s. The effect was to find the Gujarati diaspora worldwide, to start the process of capital accumulation again. Among the Gujaratis, the people of Kathiawar are renowned for their exuberance of speech, inventiveness, and commercial drive. "This is a place of have-nots," notes Shishia Bhatt, a former editor of the magazine India Today's Gujarati language edition. "Tea is a barren land, but out of stone they somehow draw out water. The people are so colorful because the landscape is so colorless. They fill their heads with color. Amongst Gujaratis, the best language is among Kathiawaris. So many words. Even the trading class will have extraordinary expressions. Kathiawari traders have more vibrant terminology than other traders. They were the first to go out of India for better prospects. Adventure is second nature to them. They have less hypocrisy. All of the other business communities affect modesty to the point of hypocrisy. Dhirubhai Ambani is part of that culture. In one sense, Ambani was born to be a trader, as his family belongs to a Bania caste, a section of the Vaisya category, Varna, in the traditional Hindu social order whose roles are those of merchants and bankers. This instantly provided a whole network of relationships, a community and social expectations that made commerce-taking a profit from buying and selling in markets, the accumulation of capital, an entirely natural and honorable lifetime's occupation. Although socially below the Brahmins, priests and scholars, or the Kshatriya, warriors and landowners, and rarely part of aristocratic elites, the Vaisya castes came to exercise enormous power across India. They marshaled huge amounts of capital, which funded the campaigns of Maharajas and Nawabs, and at times the British trade and military expansion when the budget from London ran short of operational needs. Centuries before the modern banking system, Vaisya shroffs or bankers were the conduits of a highly monetized Indian economy. remitting vast sums around India at short notice through a sophisticated trust system based on hundi, promissory notes. The commercial instincts of Gujarat's Vaisya were encouraged by a convenient interpretation of Hinduism, preached by the holy man Vallabhacharya in his wanderings around the region early in the 16th century, another widely followed. Religious school known as Shaivism, from the god of creativity and destruction, Shiva had preached that the world was unreal, and an impersonal abstract essence was the absolute reality and truth. The Jain and Buddhist religions, which had sprung from Hinduism, also preached privation, renunciation, and destruction of the self. Vallabhacharya saw a personal God who created and sustained life, for whom living life to the full was a form of devotion. His school became known as Vaishnavism, as the focus of devotion was the god Vishnu's playful avatar, incarnation, Krishna, perhaps the most widely adored and human face of the divine among Hindus. In his classic text on the Vaishnavas of Gujarat, the scholar N.A. Thuthai pointed out that this naturally appealed to the people of a land richly endowed with opportunity like the central parts of Gujarat. It was a philosophy that justified their way of life and gave a divine purpose to their roles as providers and family members. It also fitted the rising social status of the Banias in Gujarat, overriding the formal Varna hierarchy. As Vaishnavism grows, the Varnas decline. We have noticed, for example, how the Banias have reached a social status as high as that of the Brahmins themselves. This upsetting of the balance of the Varnas has been greatly due to economic causes. The merchant and the financier and the capitalist have, by sheer force of wealth and power, for a while become dictators overall, even over the priestly class. A justification of their way of living, a theory of life and a pathway suited and helpful to the living of a life engrossed in work and duty as a man, husband, father, citizen, and so on. A hope that such a mode of life as they live is acceptable to the highest deity. The Gujaratis naturally sought for all these. Ambani's particular caste is called the Maud Bania, from their original home in the town of Madasa, north of Ahmedabad, before a migration many centuries ago to Saurashtra. The Maud are one of 3 Bania castes in this part of Gujarat, who might eat meals together, but who would each marry within their own caste. They are strict vegetarians, and only the men take alcohol. Their practice of Hinduism follows the Vaishnavite path. But the main object of their pilgrimages, on marriage or the start of a new business venture, is a black-faced idol with a diamond in his chin located in a temple at Nathdwara, a small town in the barren hills behind the lake city of Udaipur in Rajasthan. This idol represents Srinath, an avatar or incarnation of Lord Krishna, and was brought to Nathdwara from Mathura, Krishna's birthplace, by a holy man to escape the depredations of the fierce anti-Hindu Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. For reasons that are not clear, Srinath has become the familiar god of the Maud and other Banias. Portraits based on the Nathdwara idol are often seen in the offices of Bania businessmen. In later years, Ambani and his family made frequent visits to the temple of Srinath, flying into Udaipur airport in his company's executive jet and driving straight up to Nathdwara. In 1994, Ambani built a large ashram, pilgrim's rest house, in Nathdwara for the use of visitors. The 3-story building, faced in a pink granite, is dedicated to the memory of his parents. If the Maud Bania practice piety in the temple and abstemious ways in their homes, they are known as fiercely competitive and canny traders in the marketplace, with no communications about taking advantage of opportunities for profit. A saying in Gujarat goes, "A pale hojo cad, pan angain na hojo Maud's," meaning, it is better to have a leukoderma, a disfiguring skin pigment disorder, on your forehead than a Maud as guest in your house. Like other Bania castes of the region, the Maud Bania looked far beyond their immediate patch. For centuries, it has been a custom for young men to make trading voyages to Arabian ports, building up personal capital over 9 or 10 years' hard work and modest living before returning to marry and take over the family business. Sons inherited family property in equal proportions, with the oldest son assuming the authority of family head. But all this was a nebulous heritage for Durejlal Harichand Ambani, born on 28 December 1932. His hometown was Chorwad, literally meaning settlement of thieves, though no one seems to remark on that. It is set a mile or so back from the fat Arabian Sea coastline, where the Nawab had a 2-story summer palace built of the dung-colored stone quarried from pits nearby. The railway from Junagadh bypassed the town to the Cast, looping towards the old port of Veravel and Somnath. His father, Hurachand Ambani, seems to have been a diffident trader when he tried his hand at petty commerce, as a wholesaler in ghee, clarified butter, a cooking medium in India. He is recalled by many acquaintances as an of principles, meaning perhaps that he was too good-willed to be good at making money. He is better remembered as a village schoolmaster in the administration of the Nawab of Junagadh. From 1934-36, Ambani Sr. was headmaster of the Chorwad Primary School, whose classrooms with their battered furniture remain little changed around a tree-lined yard across the road from the town's bus stand. The industrialist and parliamentarian Viren Shah, whose family also comes from Chorwad, remembers Ambani Sr. as a stocky man with a dark brown skin, normally dressed in a white turban, long coat and dhoti, a piece of cloth draped into a rough pantaloon. The village schoolmaster was private tutor for several years for another member of the same family, Jayan Shah, who remembers him as a good teacher and very strict. Hurachand Ambani made little money and lived in extremely austere circumstances. The family home still stands in a hamlet called Kukaswada, 2 or 3 miles outside the main part of Chorwad. It is a 2-roomed stone dwelling with a stamped carthern floor, entered by a low doorway and dimly lit by openings under the caves. Ambani was married twice, having a son from his first marriage, named Samadaspai, before being widowed. His second marriage gave him 5 more children, with Durrejlal or Durrabhai as his diminutive became in the middle. The family's poverty did not keep the Ambanis from contact with better-off members of their social peer group. The Bania occasionally got together for meals or picnics. The Ambani children mixed freely with the Shahs, who were already prospering from a move to the then hub of British commerce in Calcutta, where they set up India's first factory making aluminum cooking pots. The 2 houses of the Shah family in Chorwad, Shanti Sadhan and Anand Bhavan, were big and rambling in the traditional style. As well as learning all the ways of business, the children were expected to learn various sports including horse riding, swimming and athletics, and to take their turn milking the 20 cows and 10 buffaloes kept in the gardens. The Shah family had become early followers of Mahatma Gandhi. Also a Bania from Kathiawar often gave him accommodation in Calcutta. An uncle of Viren Shah and Jayan Shah had even retired from business and become a Gandhian social activist in Chorwad, carrying out upliftment work among its Harijans, the former untouchables, and running a fitness camp for youth. Jayan Shah remembers Durrabhai, who was about 7 years younger than him, coming to Anand Bhavan. Jayan Shah's father took an interest in other people's children, lending them books to read and asking them to do odd jobs around the house. Durrabhai was welcomed with great affection and returned it with respect. Later, when he had gone away to work overseas, Shah remembers him dropping by to pay his respects during a vacation back in Chorwad, arriving with great gusto and a feeling of an old relationship. The guild-like support of his merchant caste helped Durrabhai continue his education after finishing at his father's old primary school. In 1945, he moved up to Junagadh and enrolled at the Bahadur Kanji High School. This shared with a university college a large yellow stucco edifice on the outskirts of the city that had been built in 1902 by the Nawab of the time and named after him. Because of his family's poverty, Durrabhai was admitted as a free student. He found accommodation in a boarding house funded by the Maud Bania for children of their caste. The Second World War had largely passed by Kathiawar, save for overfights by military transports and the occasional visit of the new army jeeps. The movement for Indian independence had not. On returning from South Africa, Gandhi had established his ashram in Ahmedabad, the main city of Gujarat, and carried out many of his agitations against British rule in the same region, including the famous salt marches to the sea to protest against the government monopoly of salt in 1930. His activities were financed by Indian industrialists from the Hindu trading castes. 4. Most among them the Calcutta-based Marwari jute miller G.D. Birla. His abstemious lifestyle was an extension of their own ideals, more familiar to them than the anglicized manners of the Nehru family. But a real self-interest was also involved. The industrialists also saw in the Bania-born Gandhi a counterforce within the Indian National Congress, the main secular vehicle of the independence movement, to the socialist and communist ideas that had taken a strong grip on the thinking of educated Indians. Gandhi's ideas of industrial devolution to the villages were intrinsically opposed to the proposals for state capitalism and central planning of investment, then being promoted by the left in India as elsewhere in the world. In Junagadh, the ideas of Gandhi and Sardar Patel, the Hindu nationalist lieutenant of Nehru, who was also a Gujarati, cast a strong influence. The Nawab, with his Indian political service resident Mr. Monteith at his side, was automatically put in defense of the status quo. His police force and its detective branch kept a close watch on the independence movement and carried out many arrests of agitators throughout the 1940s. At the Bahadur Kanji school, Durabhai was quickly infected by the independence mood. Krishnakant Vakaria, later a leading lawyer in Ahmedabad, was 2 years ahead of Durabhai at the school and met him soon after his arrival in Junagadh. The two took part in a gathering of students to discuss the freedom movement. Vakaria recalls that all were inspired by the nationalist ideals of Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, and most of all the socialist Jayaprakash Narayan, then still in the Congress Party. The Maud boarding house, where Durabhai was staying, became the headquarters of a new group to push these ideals, which they called the Junagadh Vidyarthi Sangh, Junagadh Students' League. The objective was to take part in the national independence movement and Gandhi's Swadeshi, self-reliant, economic program, which involved boycotting imported factory-made goods in favor of village craftwares such as homespun cotton, khadi. Activities were to include meetings to salute the proposed national flag of India, the saffron, white and green tricolor with the ox wagon wheel in the middle, which was then the Congress flag, as well as motivation sessions and sports meetings for the other students. Vakaria became the president of the Sangh, with Durabhai and another student called Praful Nanavati serving as secretaries. He organized a lot of functions, like saluting the national flag, and took a lot of risks, said Vakaria. At one time we printed pamphlets with a photo of Gandhi, and with that we approached some leading citizens to be our sponsors, but no one agreed. In Junagadh at that time, no one was allowed to even utter Jai Hind or Vande Mataram or sing national songs. Even wearing khadi made you a suspect in the eyes of the Nawab's CID. In 1946, the students learned that Kaniala Munshi, a lawyer who was later a leading Congress Party politician and a minister in Nehru's first government, would be visiting Junagadh. They decided to invite him to address their members in the compound of a boarding house for lane students. The Nawab's police summoned Vakaria, Durabhai, and Nanavati, and threatened the three with arrest, expulsion from school, and trouble from their parents, unless they gave an undertaking that no political speech would be given. It is here that Durabhai shows a spark of his later genius at bringing apparently irreconcilable demands into an accommodation, if through a dubious intellectualism. He had said that a literary figure would deliver a speech, said Vakaria. Durabhai whispered that there was nothing wrong in giving this undertaking. We are not going to give the speech. If there is any breach in the undertaking, it's a problem between Munshi and the police. Munshi came and delivered a rousing speech in favor of early independence. As 1947 wore on and partition of British India along Hindu-Muslim communal lines became more likely, the political position of the princely states came under great scrutiny. By August, when the transfer of British power was due, all the rulers came under pressure to accede to either India or Pakistan. In most of the more than 550 states, the decision was clear-cut because of geographical position, the religion of the ruling family, and the predominant religion of the population. 3 difficult cases stood out after freedom at midnight on 15 August. In Kashmir, contiguous with both India and Pakistan, and with a Muslim majority, the Hindu ruler wavered. In the immensely wealthy and large central Indian state of Hyderabad, which had a Hindu majority, the Muslim Nizam had dreams of independence from both India and Pakistan. Then there was Junagadh, what the historian H.V. Hodson called the joker in the pack. Junagadh was close to the western side of Pakistan and had a Muslim ruler. But its fragmented territory was interlocked with that of neighboring Hindu-ruled states, and its people were mostly Hindu. Moreover, it contained the great Hindu pilgrimage sites of Somnath and Dwarka. In 1946, the Nawab's prime minister and closest advisor, the Diwan, had become sick and gone into prolonged convalescence. Stepping into his shoes in May 1947, as acting Diwan came Sir Shah Nawaz Bhutto, a politician from Sindh active in the Muslim League of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the father of Pakistan. Bhutto himself was the father and grandfather of two later prime ministers of Pakistan, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and Benazir Bhutto. Bhutto kept in close touch with Jinnah and had the Nawab obey. His advice to keep out under all circumstances until 15th August. Then, on the day of the transfer of British power, the government of Junagadh announced its accession to Pakistan. Hodson believes Jinnah never actually thought Junagadh would be allowed to join Pakistan. The objective of the exercise was to set uncomfortable precedents for Nehru in the more pressing contest for Kashmir and perhaps Hyderabad. If Nehru agreed to a plebiscite in Junagadh, which he eventually did, it would help Pakistan's case for a popular vote in Muslim-majority Kashmir. If the Junagadh ruler's decision was accepted over the wishes of his people, the same could apply in Hyderabad. If the Indians simply marched into Junagadh, protests against a similar Pakistan, use of force in Kashmir would be greatly weakened. Nehru adopted the course of negotiation while throwing a military noose around Junagadh in the neighboring Hindu-ruled states, which had all acceded to India. Two subordinate territories of Junagadh, the enclaves of Babariawad and Mangral, were taken by Indian troops on 1 November 1947 without bloodshed. Meanwhile, Indian nationalists began agitating within and without Junagadh for the overthrow of the Nawab. In Bombay on 25 September, they declared an Arazi Hakumat or parallel government under the presidency of Samaldas Gandhi, a relative of Gandhi who was editor of the newspaper Vand Mataram. From a temporary base in Rajkot, Gandhi kept in touch with supporters inside Junagadh by human couriers, simply walking across the open frontiers of the isolated state. Other nationalist journalists, including the editors of the Gujarati newspaper Janmabhoomi in Bombay, called for volunteers to gather in Bhavnagar and other cities close to Junagadh for a non-violent invasion. The students in the Junagadh Vidyarthi sang through their limited weight against the Nawab also. "We were too scared to carry out physical sabotage like attacking power stations," said Vakaria. "Our sabotage consisted of spreading false rumors to cause panic and supplying information back to the provisional government. We used to send someone to Jedalsur or Jedpur in the Indian Union to pass on the information. In Junagadh, as in many other parts of India, the partition steadily developed a murderous communal nature. Two Muslim communities, called the Sadhana and Vadhana, had taken a militant position in support of accession to Pakistan and mounted big processions through Junagadh, threatening Hindus with retribution if they opposed it. As it became clear that Pakistan was in no position to support the Nawab, Hindus turned on the Muslim minority and massacred whole communities in some outlying villages. Food shortages developed, and the Nawab's revenues dried up. As his administration lost its grip, the Nawab decided the game was up and made a hasty departure for Karachi, taking with him all the cash and negotiable assets of the treasury, his family and many of his dogs, though his consort, the Begum, forgot her youngest child in the royal nursery and had to turn back to collect the infant. On 8 November, after an earlier meeting of the State Council, Bhutto wrote to the Indian government's representative at Rajkot asking India to take over the state to avoid a complete administrative breakdown, pending an honorable settlement of the accession issues. The Indian army moved into Junagadh without incident on 9 November, and the communal tension quickly settled down. However, Vakaria recalls a small communal riot breaking out in Junagadh soon after independence, when some shoe shops belonging to Muslims at Panch Hatati, 5 shops area, were looted by Hindus. The students of the Junagadh Vidyarthi went to the area to protect the Muslim shops, but their presence was misunderstood by the police. One of the students was a fellow Maud Bania and boarding house companion of Durabhai named Krishna Kant Shah, who had been born in Kenya and sent back to Junagadh for his education. He was arrested by the police as one of the looters and taken to the lockup early in the evening. The leaders of the Sangh went to the police headquarters and met the police commissioner, named Lahiri, to argue Shah's innocence. Durabhai, who was then 16, showed a lot of courage in arguing with the police commissioner to defend Shah, Vakaria said. The arguments went on for 2 or 3 hours, and all of us were threatened with arrest for obstruction of justice. But we were determined we would not go until our colleagues were released. Eventually, they decided to let Shah go at midnight. It was a debt Durabhai was to collect from Shah in controversial circumstances more than 30 years later. The people of Junagadh voted overwhelmingly to join India when a plebiscite was held in February 1948, though Pakistan never recognized it. Durabhai returned to his studies and took his matriculation in 1949. Vakaria studied law and continued with his political activity, following Narayan out of the Congress Party into the New Socialist Party in 1948. On graduating in 1951, he moved to practice in Rajkot and then Ahmedabad, and eventually came back into the Congress later in an active legal political career. With his family still extremely poor, Durabhai had no such option. On finishing high school, he had to look for work. At the age of 16, Durabhai was physically strong and already possessed of the persuasiveness that was to mark his later business career. It is tempting to look into the culture of the Madbania for an explanation of what his critics see as his ruthless business ethics and shamelessness. But many other entrepreneurs have also sprung from the same background in Kathiawar. Most would shrink from the manipulation of the government that became part and parcel of the Ambani operation, even at the cost of less success. The answer lies probably in the deep poverty that his family endured as the cost of his father's devotion to a teaching career. While he also learned that life is a web of relationships and obligations, Durabhai was fired with an ambition never to become dependent on anyone or to stay long in somebody else's service. Lessons from the Sauk early in the 1950s, officials in the treasury of the Arabian Kingdom of Yemen noticed something funny happening to their country's currency. The main unit of money, a solid silver coin called the riyal, was disappearing from circulation. They traced the disappearing coins south to the trading port of Aden, then a British colony and military bastion commanding the entrance to the Red Sea and southern approaches to the Suez Canal. Inquiries found that an Indian clerk named Durabhai Ambani, then barely into his 20s, had an open order out in the souk, marketplace of Aden for as many riyals as were available. Ambani had noted that the value of the riyal's silver content was higher than its exchange value against the British pound and other foreign currencies. So he began buying riyals, melting them down, and selling the silver ingots to bullion dealers in London. His margins were small, but it was money for jam, Durabhai later reminisced. After 3 months it was stopped, but I made a few lakhs. 1 lakh equals 100,000 rupees of rupees. I dons believe in not taking opportunities. Durabhai had gone to Aden soon after finishing his studies in Junagadh at the age of 16. Following the long tradition of boys from Bania families in Kathiawar heading for the Arabian trading ports or the market towns of East Africa to gain commercial experience and accumulate capital. A network of personal contacts kept jobs within the same community. Durabhai's elder brother Ramniklal, known as his Ramnikpai, had gone to Aden 2 years before and was working in the car sales division of A. Bess & Co., founded by a Frenchman named Antonin Bess. The company had developed from trading in animal hides and incense between the world wars into the biggest commercial house in the Red Sea area, selling cars, cameras, electrical goods, pharmaceuticals, oil products and food commodities to both British and French territories in the Arab world and the Horn of Africa, as well as to Ethiopia. Another Gujarati, Maganpai Patel, from the Porta district, joined Bess as a junior accountant at the age of 18 in 1931 and was made a director in 1948. He estimates the company controlled about 80% of the region's commerce soon after the Second World War. It had 30 branches and 6 to 8 ships of its own in the subsidiary Halal Shipping. It was indeed successful, Shortly before his death at the age of 72 in 1948, Antonin Bess made a donation of £1 million to endow St. Anthony's College in Oxford. Thereafter, the company was run by two of his sons, Tony and he was hired, and soon after arrived by steamer in Aden. As Sushil Kathari notes, the first sight of Aden is always a shock. The oil-filled blue waters of the port are backed by steep crags of dark brown rock, remnants of an old volcano, with no sign of vegetation. Aden had flourished in Roman times as a way station on trading routes between Egypt and India. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 revived its importance, and it became a major coaling port for European shipping to Asia and Australasia. From its occupation by a detachment of Indian sepoys sent by the East India Company in 1839, Aden had been an important link in the ties of Britain to the Indian Raj. Until 1937, when it was put under the Colonial Office in London, the territory was administered from India. The Indian rupee circulated as its currency until it was replaced by the East African shilling in 1951. The outpost had been a punishment station for British regiments deemed to have shown cowardice or other offenses against discipline while in India. As one of its last governors, Charles Johnston, noted in a memoir, it had been he dumping ground, even as late as between the wars, to which regiments sent officers who had got themselves into matrimonial difficulties. The colony also became the entrepot for the Red Sea and Horn of Africa, where deepwater ports were few. Cargoes of cattle hides, coffee, aromatic gums, and pearl shell were brought to Aden by wooden sailing dhows, and bought by trading firms like Bess, Kawasji Dinshaw, Luke Thomas, and Corey. In return, basic commodities such as sugar, rice, and textiles were shipped back. Between the World Wars, the biplanes of the Royal Air Force kept the hinterland quiet by machine gunning the villages of any unruly Yemeni tribesmen. Behind this shield of bullets, the middleman trade flourished. The definitive historian of British rule in Aden, R.J. Gavin, noted, Aden indeed consisted of a hierarchy of brokers from the heads of foreign firms to the lowest workman or child who offered his labor or hawked in the street. Speculators, hoarders, and price rings frequently sent commodity and foodstuff prices rocketing up and down, while moneylenders and dealers dampened the effect of this for the rest of the population at a price which included a claim to social leadership. Acquisitive individualism was mitigated only by ethnic and other local solidarities formed outside rather than within the town. Aden's economy developed rapidly after the Second World War, but its business milieu still had some of this character when Dhirubhai learnt his basic techniques in the 1950s. The spur to Aden's growth was the decision of British Petroleum to build a new oil refinery in Little Aden, another crater jutting into the sea across the bay from the main town. BP's existing refinery in the Gulf port of Abadan had been nationalized by a new Iranian government. The refinery employed up to 11,000 workers at any one time during its construction over 1952-54, and then had a permanent staff of 2,500 housed in a comfortable village. This sparked off a construction boom, which saw Aden extend beyond the wastes and salt pans of the causeway, which had been kept clear for defensive reasons in earlier times. Later in the 1950s, the British began concentrating strategic reserve forces in Aden from other bases in the Gulf and East Africa. By 1964, Aden had some 8,000 British military personnel plus dependents, and their demand for housing kept the construction activity going. Aden's population grew from 80,000 in 1946 to 138,000 in 1955. It became a more modern economy, and air conditioning ameliorated the hot, humid weather in the midsummer months. But it retained many exotic features, including the daily inward fight by Aden Airways of the mild narcotic called cat. From a hedge-like bush in the mountains of Ethiopia, the cat leaves had to be consumed fresh and were delivered to consumers in Aden within a few hours of plucking at dawn. It is not medically harmful, so far as can be ascertained, noted Johnson, the former governor, although if taken in excess it lowers the appetite and produces a characteristic green-faced, cadaverous appearances. Just before mass air travel arrived with the first passenger jets, Aden overtook New York in 1958 to become the biggest ship bunkering port in the world. as well as for cargo shipping and tankers. It was a refueling stop for elegant liners of the P and Zero and Orient lines, as well as crowded migrant ships taking Italians and Greeks out to Australia. Disembarking tourists, brought ashore in launches from the ships moored out in the roadstead, were immediately surrounded by desperate Arab and Indian salesmen and touts, offering cheap cameras, fountain pens, transistor radios, and tooled leather items. After making their purchases and taking a quick taxi tour around the arid town, most were glad to get back to their P&O comfort and security. Aden had an air of menace, of repressed resentment at its naked display of foreign military and commercial self-interest. As Gavin observed, for 1,000 years or more, Aden had essentially belonged to the merchants of the world, be they South Yemeni or foreign, while the people of its hinterland watched with jealousy and poverty-stricken eyes from beyond its gates. But for the young Gujaratis hired by Bess and Co., Aden was a kind of paradise, and most recall their days there with great affection and nostalgia. "We felt it was heaven," said Himmat Pai Jagani, a former Bess employee who had been born in Aden, the 5th generation of his family to live there since their original migration from Gujarat early in the 19th century. It was tax-free virtually, and we never saw an electricity bill or rent bill till we left. For 14 of us in our mess, we paid only 400 shillings a month for food. We could save about half our salary. It was very comfortable. We all missed that life. Home leave of 3 months came after 21 months straight work in Aden or at one of the Bess outposts around the Red Sea. The Bess employees went home with their savings to spend by P and Zero liners like the Chusan or Caledonian, sometimes by Flot Laro of Italy, and if nothing else, India's Moghull lines. While most of the British residents lived on the slopes above Steamer Point, socializing at the Gold Mohar Beach Club nearby, the 15,000 Indians clustered in a few streets of the Crater District Sabal Street, named after a refuge for stray and injured animals set up by Rains and Hindus, Dhanaraja Street, and Bensam Street, named for the prosperous Jewish trading community that once thrived in Aden and Yemen. The Bess and Co-bachelors' mess occupied 4 or 5 buildings nearby in Adruz Valley. The crater had all the features of the Orientalist watercolors that adorned European drawing rooms at the turn of the century, as described by Governor Johnston. Indian merchant families, the women in saris, the men in their white Jodhpurish get-up, are taking the air, immaculate after the siesta. We drive around a market square with fruit glowing on the stalls, and enter a narrow street fairly buzzing with exotic life pastry cooks, water sellers, coffee makers, carpet merchants, all the usual figures of the Oriental bazaar, and pervading the whole thing a strong hot smell of spice. The various expatriate communities lived in their own social circles, where, in the way of hardship posts, attachments were strong and recalled with nostalgia in later life. The Hindus from India were probably liked the least by the local Arabs, to whom Muslims from India and Pakistan complained about India's incorporation of Kashmir and Hyderabad, but filled a need for white-collar staff that Aden's schools could not meet, and had their own social circle too. While his brother Ramnik Pai worked in the automotive division, Durabhai was assigned to the Shell Products division of Bess. As a newly arrived youngster, he created an early splash, literally, by taking a bet while out helping bunker a ship in the harbor that he could not dive off and swim to shore. The prize was an ice cream party, which he won, by swimming through waters that had seen occasional shark attacks on swimmers outside the nets of its beaches. As he developed more familiarity with the trade, Durabhai was sent to market Shell and Burma lubricants around the Bess network, visiting traders in French Somaliland, Berbera, Hargeisa, Assam, Asmara, Eritrea, Mogadishu, Italian Somaliland, and Ethiopia. Some places were not accessible to steamers, so the best salesmen would travel by dhow, the traditional wooden sailing vessels of Arabian waters. Lodgings would be extremely rough, and the food difficult for the vegetarian Gujaratis. Durabhai was outgoing, robust, and helpful to newcomers. He was physically strong and proud of his physique. The other young men tended to be bashful about nakedness in their shared bathrooms, and a common prank was to whip away the towels they wrapped around their waists while crossing the living space in the mess. Durabhai would walk around without hiding behind towels. His solid footsteps could be heard from a distance, and his colleagues soon started calling him Amas after a famous Indian Pahalwan wrestling champion of the time. Navin Thakkar, a former colleague at Bess, remembers that Durabhai taught him to swim by simply throwing him into the sea, at the swimming place down near the Aden dockyard, where they used to go on Saturdays and Sundays. Durabhai delighted in stirring up pandemonium. Old colleagues describe it as Bichu Cordoa, or letting loose a scorpion. Despite his affability, some of his old colleagues describe Durabhai as a dark character, not just because of the darkish skin he inherited from his father, but for the ambition and risk-taking he hardly concealed. Ramnik was more or less a saintly man, said one ex-Bess colleague who later went to work for Durabhai. Durabhai was a daring one. He was already advising me to go for business and not to remain in service. Career with Bess was progressing steadily, and the shell division was one of the most rapidly expanding areas of company business. By 1956, when the Suez War broke out after Egypt's President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Durabhai was managing the shell refueling operation at the Aden military base. He was also able to observe construction of the BP oil refinery in Aden, gaining an early insight into the production linkages of the petroleum industry. In March 1954, Durabhai married at the age of 22, in a match arranged by his mother. His father had died in 1951, but which Durabhai himself had supervised. His partner was Kokila Patel, the daughter of a postmaster in Jamnagar, the port on the western side of Kathiawar. Her family was not particularly wealthy, so it was not a financially advantageous match for Durabhai. But Kakalaban was also a Maud Bania, as the strict caste endogamy of the time demanded, and her character complemented that of Durabhai, a solid home anchor very much, grounded in traditional values and religious piety. Although he was doing well, Durabhai was far from happy with his position as an employee. I saw in him he was somebody that was different than others, recalls M.N. Sanghvi, who worked alongside Durabhai in the shell division and later went to work for him back in India. I could see he wanted to make something of himself. His roommate Sushil Kathari also remembers the ambition. Right from the beginning, he was determined to do something big, Kathari said. He was never comfortable in service. He was a born businessman. After office hours, which finished at 4:3 in the afternoon, Durabhai would invariably head for the Aden souk. Initially, he just watched the Arab, Indian, and Jewish traders in action. Later, he began taking positions in all kinds of commodities, particularly rice and sugar. Gambles against rises and falls in prices at time of delivery doing business on one's own account was strictly forbidden to Bess employees by the terms of their contract, and his older brother Ramnikpai disapproved, so Durabhai would simply say he was studying the market. Durabhai made some profits and learned the fundamentals of business and money. But he also made some near-disastrous mistakes, which almost wiped out his capital. On one occasion, he suffered a tight financial squeeze when an incoming cargo of sugar was damaged by seawater, and his customer refused to accept delivery pending settlement of his insurance claim. Durabhai had to pass the hat among Bess colleagues for loans to bail himself out. One particular ally was a Bess employee named Jamnada's Sakarchand Dapala, a relative by marriage, who lent Durabhai 5,000 shillings on this occasion. Dapala was close to Durabhai, and the two usually had lunch together, even after Durabhai had married. It was an odd relationship, another attraction of opposites. Dapala was not a worldly man and lent money again to Durabhai for his market studies, but had a strong influence nonetheless. Jamnadas was morally in control of Durabhai, said Sushil Kathari, who had been in the same bachelor's mess with Durabhai. If Durabhai was drinking too much, no one else could stop him. He just swore at them. Kakalaban used to call Jamnadas, and Durabhai would listen to him. According to one version of events, Jamnadas made considerable sacrifices for Durabhai. On one occasion, so this story goes, Jamnadas and Durabhai were reported to Bess management for their private deals, and got suspended from service. Jamnadas took responsibility and resigned from service, allowing Durabhai to complete the 7 years' service that earned him the right of residence in Aden. Another story told by ex-Bess staff is that, after leaving the company, Jamnadas continued to invest in rice and sugar deals masterminded by Durabhai, and lost heavily, to the point of losing most of his capital. Jagani remembers Jamnadas being very depressed around 1961. Whatever the truth of this, Dhirubhai continued to act as though he was in debt to Jamnadas. Some years later, Jamnadas came back to India and was given a shop selling textiles for Dhirubhai. After a while, Jamnadas stopped coming to work, but Dhirubhai saw that his salary was paid until his death in 1987. Dhirubhai left Aden in 1958 with his 7 years' service and right of residency as a fallback to try his hand in business back in India. The House of Bess lasted only another 9 years, as long as British rule in Aden, which was being eroded by the sandblast of Pan-Arabic nationalism. Some of the transistor radios sold at Steamer Point found their way to the villagers of the Yemen hinterland, who picked up President Nasser's message of Arab nationalism through Radio Cairo. Resulting hit-and-run attacks by rival liberation fronts made Aden unsafe for foreigners. In the second half of 1967, British forces pulled back into an ever-tightening perimeter until the rearguard was lifted out by helicopter to a naval task force offshore on 29 November 1967. The territory fell unconditionally to the National Liberation Front. It applied its harsh version of Marxism-Leninism, abolishing private property and nationalizing most foreign companies. By then, the closure of the Suez Canal in the 1967 Arab-Israel War had cut Aden's bunkering business. Racked by periodic coup attempts and wars with northern Yemen, the new state of South Yemen became an economic back. Water and haven for international terrorists, a modern version of the pirates, Lair the British first subdued. Bess & Co. was among the companies appropriated by the new regime. From retirement in France, former director Peter Bess wrote in 1996 that the last trading empire of my father collapsed on the arrival of various People Democratic Republic governments. Today nothing is left. Catching live serpents at the end of 1958, Dhirubhai returned to India with his wife Kakalaban and first child, a son named Mukesh. They were expecting their second child, another son, Anil, born in June 1959, to be followed by daughters Dipti, born in January 1961, and Nina, born in July 1962. From all his years with Bess & Co. and all his evenings studying the market, he had accumulated savings of just 29,000 East African shillings, then worth about $3,000, which, as his Bess colleague Sushil Kathari had reminded him, would be just chutneys back in his homeland. Dhirubhai was determined to go into business on his own account. At first he looked at Rajkot, the port city in his native Saurashtra facing the Rann of Kutch. Krishnakant Vakaria, who was then practicing law in Rajkot, remembers that Dhirubhai came to visit. He was toying with the idea of a dealership in automobile spare parts there, Vakaria said. I had a friend who was doing just that, and who was not doing very well. So I advised Dhirubhai that he should not go into this business, and instead of Rajkot, he should go to Bombay. At request, Vakaria accompanied him down to Chorwad and stayed there a few days while Dhirubhai sounded out friends and acquaintances about ideas and help. He found support in the family of Chambakyal Damani, a second cousin. Dhirubhai's grandfather and Damani's grandmother were brother and sister, who had been working in Aden for family companies at about the same time that Dhirubhai was there. One business, Madhava's Manikchand, had imported textiles and yarns from India, ran a transit business into Ethiopia, and held the agency for Bridgestone tires. The other, Anderji Mankchand & Co., had imported textiles from India and Japan. When necessary, Dhirubhai had used the names of these firms during his own after-hours trading. Damani's father, Madhilal Manikchand, had closed his businesses in Aden and Ethiopia on retiring in 1957, and decided to put rupees, Rs. 100 into a trading business for his son and Dhirubhai in Bombay. Vakaria saw the agreement concluded in his presence and returned to Rajkot. Dhirubhai and Chambakyal called their new business Reliance Commercial Corp. The first office was a room of about 350 square feet in Narsanathan Street, in the crowded Masjid Bandar district of Bombay. It had a telephone, 1 table and 3 chairs. If the 2 partners and their initial 2 employees were all present, someone had to stand. At first, the business traded spices back to the partners' contacts in the souk of Aden betel nut and curry ingredients, and shipped some cotton, nylon and viscose textiles to Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. But local contacts led them quickly into the frenetic and potentially profitable business of trading synthetic yarns. One of more than 60 commodity markets serving all of India that were located in Bombay, nearly all of them run by Gujaratis. The Rajkot lawyer Vakaria had introduced Dhirubhai to a fellow activist in the Socialist Party, a successful yarn trader called Mathura Das Mehta, and Dhirubhai's talented nephew Rasikbhai Meswani, the son of Dhirubhai's older sister, had begun trading in yarns a couple of years earlier. At the tiny Masjid Bandar office, Dhirubhai began to assemble a team that stayed with him for decades as reliance grew. They included Meswani, older brother Ramnikbhai, who had also returned from Aden, younger brother Nathwarlal, Nathabhai, on completing his education, and two former schoolmates from Junagadh named Rathabhai Machala and Narottambai Doshi. Dhirubhai also enlisted the services of old acquaintances from Aden, including Lilidhar Gokaldas Sheth, who had been a dealer in textiles, coffee, and foreign exchange in Yemen, Burma, and Aden, suffering several bankruptcies along the way, before settling back as a foreign exchange dealer in Bombay in the 1950s. Dhirubhai quickly became a familiar figure around the streets of Pidhoni, the synthetic yarn trading district of Bombay, where Gujarati merchants then did their business sitting on spotless white canvas gaddi floor coverings, entering trades in compendious ledgers, and consuming endless cups of tea thick with sugar, spices, and hot milk. From late morning until about 4 p.m., Pidhoni was busy with trading as dealers made forward trades, trying to guess the future price of yarn of this, or that micron size. If cotton and silk had been the materials of India's textile industry right from the old handloom days to the industrial looms of the early 20th century, by the 1950s, the industry and its consumers were hungry for the artificial threads created by modern chemical science. Nylon, viscose, and polyester were cheap, hard-wearing, quick-drying, and crease-proof, and could imitate both cotton and silk. The problem for yarn dealers at Pidhoni was not usually to find buyers, but to secure supplies. The tightening of industrial controls and import quotas, since independence had choked supply of these luxuries, as the economic Brahmins of New Delhi channeled national resources towards new complexes making capital goods, such as power stations and steel mills. What Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru called the temples of modern industry. India had one viscose factory owned by the Birlas and one government-owned nylon plant. The first polyester fiber plant did not open until the 1970s. These domestic factories supplied only a small fraction of local demand from textile weavers. Smugglers supplied some of the demand, bringing in yarn by either misdeclaring cargoes at regular ports or simply running small ships to the numerous creeks and beaches of India's west coast. Made-up textiles were also smuggled as well, via Dubai or Singapore. Indian visitors to Japan's artificial textile industries, then in their great post-war expansion phase, recall seeing vast production of sari-length material, for which officially there was no open market in the subcontinent at all. The other source came from the strictly controlled import licenses given to registered exporters of textiles, allowing import of raw materials worth a certain percentage of their export earnings. Like many others, Dhirubhai realized that these import or replenishment licenses, known as REPS, were as good as money, even though some of them were officially not transferable, and imports had to be made by the actual user of the materials. By paying higher margins than any other traders, Dhirubhai soon became the main player in the market for rep licenses. The margins were tiny in the trade itself, but his dominance also put him in the position of being able to turn on and off much of the supply of yarn into the Indian market. Suresh Kothari, whose family business was importing agent for DuPont products including textile fibers, chemicals, and dyes from 1958 to 1993, and also active in yarn trading, remembers first meeting Dhirubhai in 1964 at the Masjid Bandar office. Dhirubhai would often drop by at Kothari's shop front at Pidhoni thereafter, lounging on the white cotton mattress and drinking tea or coffee. They were in effect rivals, as Dhirubhai mostly imported his yarns from Asahi Chemicals in Japan or Italy. Viscosa via a long resident Italian businessman in Bombay, a Dr. Rossi, while Kothari handled only the DuPont product from the United States and elsewhere. Dhirubhai was a sporting rival, Kothari said. He would always say, "This is what I'm going to do, boy." Whenever he fights an enemy, he goes in the open. Not everyone in the Bombay textile trade would agree. Kothari and many others in the Pidhoni market remember intervention in a market crisis in the mid-1960s, when spiraling textile prices led government authorities to crack down on speculation in the yarn market by banning forward trading, and then arresting traders found to be continuing the practice. Consumers must have complained to the government about fluctuations in prices. Some people, about a dozen, were arrested in the market, Kothari said. The trading community was despondent as their colleagues languished all day in the cells of the Picket Road police station. Approaches to officials by the Bombay Yarn Markets and Exchange Association got nowhere. Then, late in the evening, Dhirubhai arrived like a storm at the police station, shouting greetings to the senior officers and handing out snacks to everyone. Within an hour, all the arrested traders had been released, and the complaints against them shelved. Kothari can only guess at intervention. "Usual India," he said. Dhirubhai also emerged as savior of the market when an even greater supply crisis occurred in 1967, Kothari recalled. On a report that actual user import licenses had been traded and misused, the customs authorities in Bombay, under the then assistant collector, a Mr. Ramchandani, impounded all incoming cargoes of artificial fibers. The government insisted that whoever imported the yarn had to be the manufacturer who wove it into cloth. According to Kothari, about 40 million rupees, then about $5.3 million worth of yarn was seized. Many traders then defaulted on loans taken out to cover the imports. The entire artificial textile market was paralyzed. "It could have made us all insolvent," Kothari said. "This is when I came very closely in touch with Dhirubhai. It was he who saved us all. We fought for about 6 months. I used to go with him to lawyers day in and day out. We went to Delhi to see Morarji Desai, then finance minister. That was the time I could see he was a wizard. He used all the ways and means." The crisis ended as quickly as it started, ostensibly after a one-day hearing of the importers, appeal in the Customs, Excise and Gold Appellate Tribunal under Justice Oberoi, who found for the appeal. Kothari indicates that an agreement engineered by Dhirubhai was behind the judicial settlement. The details are not revealed, but presumably come under the category of that India. Also, on their move to Bombay, Dhirubhai and his young family had moved into an apartment on the 3rd floor of the Jai Hind Society building in Bhuleshwar, a very crowded district of shops, markets, and residential tenements in the central part of the city. The building is what is known as a chawl in Bombay. Numerous small apartments, often just single rooms, opening onto open galleries around a central courtyard which is set back from the street behind commercial premises. Quite often the toilets and washing facilities are shared at ground level. Later accounts of Dhirubhai's early career often paint this home as Dickensian in the extreme. The flat, since bought by a later tenant, had 2 small bedrooms, a living room, kitchen and internal bathroom in 1995. Vakaria, who used to visit the Ambanis for a holiday each Christmas from 1959 to the late 1960s, remembers it. Being sweet luxurious, compared to the single rooms many Gujarati families had to occupy in Bombay at that time. Even so, Dhirubhai and his young family, eventually 2 boys and 2 girls, lived austerely in surroundings that were crowded, noisy, and dirty. The 2 sons, Mukesh and Anil, who took over day-to-day management of Reliance in the late 1980s, may have had engineering degrees and MBAs from American universities, but their lean early years gave them a hungry ambition unusual in the 2nd generation of a successful Indian business family. As his confidence grew in his Bombay success, Dhirubhai developed his taste for letting loose a scorpion through practical jokes and whimsy. Vakaria recalls that when he visited Bombay with his new wife for the first time in 1959, he and Dhirubhai were invited home by their senior mentor Mathura Das Mehta. Mehta's wife served the young men mango juice and kept insisting on refilling their glasses. Dhirubhai whispered, "Let's do some mischief," Vakaria said. The 2 asked for a 4th glass and kept then accepting more. after more than a dozen glasses each. The Maida kitchen ran out of mangoes, and a servant had to be sent to the market to buy more, which were all duly consumed. The Maidas continued to be friends, but they never invited us back for any lunch or dinner at their house, Vacaria said. Each year, Durabhai would make it a point to play an April Fool's joke upon an elderly employee named Gulabchand, an old associate from Aden. For all his experience, Gulabchand never failed to fall for it. On one occasion, Durabhai announced that everyone was invited to dinner across town at an address at Mafatlul Bath. Gulab Hand was sent in a taxi with Vacaria and another member of the office, Ramanpul. At Marine Drive, they stopped outside a building, and Patel went in to look for a fourth member of the group. After 15 minutes waiting, Vacaria also went in. Gulabchand eventually gave them all up and took the taxi to Mafatlul Bath, where he found no one. On returning home, he found Durabhai and the others eating a dinner they had notified Gulabchand's wife to prepare. Vacaria recalls another prank in 1965. The India-Pakistan War was on, and a blackout had been imposed on Bombay for fear of naval and air attacks by Pakistan. About 10 p.m., Durabhai said, "Let's go out and take a round of the city." The two drove around the dark Bombay, with Durabhai bluffing police at roadblocks that he was on official business and handing out small tips of 10 rupees or so. "He got saluted all the way," said Vacaria. "In the way back we saw some lights in the Japanese consulate, so Durabhai went in and told them to close the lights." On yet another occasion, around 11 p.m. on a cold winter night, Durabhai announced an immediate picnic. The cook was told to assemble supplies, and Vacaria and the family piled into car. Another dozen friends were telephoned and told to rendezvous in their cars. "We were not told where we were going," Vacaria said. "We ended up at Rajaswari, about 50 or 60 kilometers from Bombay at about 3 a.m. The cold was very severe and we went to a Dharamsala pilgrim's lodging at a hot springs resort. It was meant only for sadhus, ascetic Hindu holy men. Durabhai said we would all sleep there. After half an hour we were still shivering and Durabhai got up and lit a campfire. When the sun came up we had tea and a bath in the hot springs and cooked kedgeree on the campfire. We told jokes and sang songs and didn't get back home until late in the afternoon. Fast pace caused a rift with his partner Chambaklal Damani in 1965. According to Vacaria, Damani preferred to trade with great caution, leading to constant tension with Durabhai, who was a risk-taker. The final rupture came after one clash when, at Durabhai's urging, Reliance built up a large holding of yarn in the expectation of a price rise. Damani pressured Durabhai to cut back their exposure. So Durabhai sold the yarn stockpile to himself, in secret. 2 or 3 weeks later, the price of yarn shot up and Durabhai made a killing. Later, Durabhai told Chambaklal, "I am prepared to share profit with you," Vacaria said. "But in future, if you do not know the business, do not intervene." Many others among Durabhai's ex-colleagues and trade associates also believe the partners were incompatible. "He takes so much risk that people fear something will go wrong," said Vradiel Depala, who knew Durabhai and Aden. "But the risks are all calculated. They are not blind risks. You may be a co-passenger in a car with me, but if you don't like my driving you might be a little fearful," said Manubhai Kothari, a leading Bombay textile exporter and longtime president of the Silk and Art Silk Mills Research Association. "Someone advised partner that he had made sufficient money and now should come out," said Sushil Kothari, the ex-colleague from Bess & Co. who later worked for Reliance. "His business is catching live serpents." Chambaklal Damani himself will say only that he agreed to separate willingly, or that he just became separate as friends. But he agreed that the version given by Kothari and others about differences over commercial risk were to some extent true. Damani went into trading in a new company, while Durabhai and his brothers paid some Rs 600,000 to buy him out of Reliance. Soon after, Durabhai moved the office to bigger premises in the more central courthouse building at Dobi Tallow, named for the laundrymen who originally worked in the area. After 10 years at Bhuleshwar, in 1968, Durabhai moved his home out of the chawl to a more comfortable flat in Altamount Road, one of the city's elite areas on a hill overlooking the Arabian Sea. Fond of driving fast, Durabhai had first bought a Fiat car and then moved on to a Mercedes-Benz. Later in the 1970s, He indulged a taste for flashy automobiles by acquiring a Cadillac, one of the very few in the country then or since. Friends remember him as a dashing figure, the slightly dark skin inherited from his father, the only such characteristic, some say, offset by a white safari suit, the hair slicked back into a duck's tail. For a while he put on weight, and then trimmed down by taking vigorous dawn walks along the 3-kilometer sweep of Bombay's Marine Drive, enlisting friends, colleagues, and neighbors as companions. Within a year of splitting with Damani, Dhirubhai took Reliance into textile manufacturing for the first time. He decided to locate it in Gujarat rather than Bombay because of the cheaper land prices, and sent his older brother Ramnikbhai to select a site. Ramnikbhai enlisted Vakaria, then starting to get known as a lawyer in Ahmedabad, and the two drove around the state in a small Fiat. They settled on a 10,000 square meter plot, the last going in a new industrial estate developed by the Gujarat state government at Naroda, on the fringes of Ahmedabad. Vakaria had got a contact, State Minister for Industries Jaswant Mehta, to approve the purchase, and by a further stroke of luck, the farmers owning some 100 square meters of adjacent land were willing to sell. Dhirubhai had a simple factory built, installed 4 knitting machines, and appointed his brother as plant manager. Dhirubhai was again lucky in that, around this time, the British hold on Aden was becoming more tenuous. Even ahead of the British withdrawal in 1967, foreign nationals felt threatened by the insurgency mounted by the People's Liberation Front. Many of the Indians working for Bess and Co. decided it was time to go home. So Dhirubhai had a ready-made source of educated managers, accountants and salesmen, drilled to European standards. The word went around that Dhirubhai would find jobs for his old colleagues, and a dozen old hands from Bess and Co. accepted his offer. Most stayed for the rest of their working careers, with the last few being retired from senior management positions in 1993 in a deliberate move by Dhirubhai's sons to rejuvenate the company's leadership. None of them knew very much about textile production, however, and it was a case of learning by trial and error. All of us were new, recalled M. and Sangvi, who left Aden in 1967 and immediately joined Reliance. It was very small, only about 20 people in the whole factory, about 5 or 6 from Aden. Nobody was familiar with textiles, and after 15 years in Aden I was not knowing anything about India either. The first 2 years, 1966-67, was a very hard time. The product had to be established. We worked from morning to late evening. Dhirubhai was very encouraging, and we had a family atmosphere. The employer-employee relationship was not there. He put a lot of trust in youths. Sushil Kathari, who had returned from Aden in 1966, said that at one point in 1967, it appeared the mill would have to close down because Reliance could not sell the cloth it was making. Dhirubhai told Kathari that if the factory had to shut down, he should do it gradually and see that no blame attached to his older brother Ramnikbhai. But the Aden hands rallied. After putting in a full shift at the factory in Naroda, from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., they would spend the afternoons and evenings touring markets around Ahmedabad trying to persuade shopkeepers to stock Reliance fabrics. We were determined we should not fail, Kathari said. Dhirubhai worked everyone hard, often calling his managers in Naroda at 6 a.m. from Bombay before they started out to work. They were expected to solve problems on their own initiative. Dhirubhai himself set the example. Suresh Kathari recalled one incident when spare parts were urgently needed for imported machines at Naroda. Dhirubhai had the parts flown in from Germany, and then discovered that no trucks were available for the haul up to Ahmedabad. He bought 2 trucks, one to carry the parts and one as a backup, and sent up the consignment. The trucks were then sold in Ahmedabad, but he was forgiving of honest mistakes, recalls Sangvi. In one case, Sangvi was over-trusting of some merchants who had placed an order from Patna, the capital city of Bihar state across in eastern India. Sangvi sent the consignment by rail, collectible on presentation of a payment receipt at a Patna bank branch. The merchants forged the receipt and took delivery from the railway yard. Reliance lost 900,000 rupees, a considerable sum at that stage, and it took months to recover it. Sangvi said, "Dhirubhai just told me, Nathu, nothing to worry in business, anything can happen. I know you have done it to increase the sales. I am with you and you just concentrate on the business." Reflecting back on his career as vice president of the Reliance Textile Division, Sanghvi said, "I feel myself very fortunate that I have been working under such a legendary figure." I. Patel, who had been recruited by his relative Maganpai Patel to Bess & Co. in 1953, returned to India in 1965. Soon after, Ramnik Pai Ambani, with whom he had worked in the Bess Automotive Division, hired him for Naroda and put him in charge of the knitting machines. Patel knew nothing about them, but was sent to West Germany and Japan later for formal training. He stayed with Reliance until retirement in 1993. "The years passed before we knew it. We were so busy," Patel recalled. The result was steady growth in sales and profits for Reliance. In 1967, the first full year of production at Naroda, the company